Testing 1, 2, 3. Okay. Welcome. On Wednesday, we're going to look at an article on techno-feudalism by Saito, and probably works better as a metaphorical idea. Um, that is, techno-feudalism may represent a new form of political economy resembling historical feudalism, characterized by social justice and the dominance of user administrators and online communities. So the idea of a user administrator as is sort of as dominant is sort of an interesting idea as well, aside from being online. Techno-fascism, defined, refers to a political ideology that combines elements of fascism with advanced technology, often emphasizing authoritarian control and the use of technology to maintain power. It critiques how powerful tech figures may exploit technology to undermine democratic systems and promote oppressive regimes. See Twitter. And this is a little map from a site that collects images for a group called Technocracy, which was appealing, I suppose, at one moment. But on the other hand, you can see that what they might want to do is take over Venezuela, Canada, and Greenland. Anyway, and these are the tables from the article, from the Saito article. And you can see forms of capitalism in the first column or the second column. Note that 1970 to 90 is a division, 90 to 10 and 10 on. And you can see the evolution or different forms emerging: industrial, commercial, financial, and rentier. They represent frontiers of accumulation. And I think actually frontier works as a kind of, in terms of what we were looking at before, in terms of boundaries or bounding. Mass production of automobiles, electronic items, and construction. So the post-war period, just-in-time production, the emergence of Japanese technology, post-war technology, etc. The correspondence is to industrial capital in Marx's text Capital. Branding and marketing represents a kind of commercial capital. I don't know if Saito is as clear as he should be about that, but there is a commercial capitalism that probably comes from the development of greater consumer society in the golden age of capitalism that some people might refer to as the post-war period, after or the rise, the parallel rise in neoliberalism. Thirdly, and under forms of capitalism is financial capitalism, financialization, which clearly comes to a head in 2007, 2008. And its correspondence is the idea of interest-bearing capital. And rentier capitalism, in terms of digital platforms, all kinds of, that's what we have now, what you're looking at now. Rentier capital, the correspondence. And these are all useful because, when you get up to volume 3 in Capital, all of these things are there. Now, working through the issues. That is, labor theory of value, tendency of the rate of profit to fall, questions of, equilibrium stuff. What does price really represent? Price's relation to value, et cetera. All of those things are at work here, and some of them need to be straightened out, some not. And there's some issues like the Okishio theorem and Morishima's work and a variety of other things that have distracted me anyway, particularly on the issue of not getting too upset about the question of the labor theory of value, because we can sort of defend it, or I can defend it, but it also requires certain other kinds of thought about what counts as cognitive capitalism, for example. So rent is the clear element, and it's certainly something that I've been interested in for a while, mainly because it allows us to not only accommodate the kinds of contrasts or contradictions or the dynamism of certain classical political economy, and particularly that's kind of where we are now in terms of a literature, a good literature, I think, or an interesting literature anyway, under digital capitalism. So there's type of rent and different rent, absolute rent, monopoly rent. Not too controversial, although, as we say, there's some other issues with that. Basis of rent based on, this is the table 2, I think, rent based on monopoly of relatively superior productive or commercial capacity that are impossible or extremely difficult for capital to produce. Examples are rent from superior land, usage fees from digital platforms that can increase productivity. So usage fees, right? Subscriptions, yes, or access, paying for access in that sense. And you can see that ranges in a whole variety of different ways. Absolute rent is rent based on artificial and structure barriers to entry in a specific industry, not reducible to different or differential rent. And an example is, unlike rent from superior land or usage fees, this is rent from land ownership itself. That is titles and, those kinds of things. Income from patents and copyrights, which, is clearly about rent. But it's a much more complicated one because, obviously you're not, it's a very specific application in terms of licensing, et cetera, unlike what we're just looking at in terms of usage fees. And thirdly, monopoly rent based on monopoly of means of production that can produce a specific use value, not reducible to either the things before, that is differential rent and absolute rent. And an example is rent from ground that can produce, as an example, extremely scarce wine grapes. So, if we were going to use what we've learned so far, this is one that's much more specific, locates itself in a kind of space. I guess we could even call it a pristine space. Your vineyard is in a, it's difficult to reproduce elsewhere, although it can be, obviously, in terms of transplanting stuff, but it takes time. Hence, that's what a monopoly kind of, it has certain, not ideological, but ideological kind of fixity. So there it is. That's table 2. So the article is, and we'll come back to it. The articles, I put the tables in further down. The article is Kohei Saito's Rentier Capitalism, Techno-Fascism, and the Destruction of the Common. And it is Kohei Saito and Ryuji Sasaki's article. And it's a very new article, 2025. Specters haunting the world, the specter of feudalism. This statement may sound odd given the prevailing optimism surrounding digital technologies. Indeed, mainstream discourses continue to celebrate the future of capitalism driven by full automation, artificial intelligence, and biotechnology. Yet a gloomier vision is increasingly taking hold. In the context of prolonged stagnation in high-income capitalist economies and rising economic inequality, some critics are now bluntly contend that capitalism is already dead. It's a little wacky, and we may not want to pursue Mackenzie Wark's opinion on that matter, but it's there. I suppose it's there. According to this perspective, however, it is not the workers of the world who have dismantled capitalism, but capital itself, which raises another interesting question, but in terms of reading Capital. But anyway, in this capitalism preceded by a revived form of feudalism, so-called techno-feudalism. This Duran 2024. Tech oligarchs, now tech bros, etc., now referred to as quote-unquote cloudalists, are portrayed as the new ruling class of the digital platform economy, extracting data, and extracting rent from all of us. This is Yanis Varoufakis's position. Now, Saito is going to challenge this, but it's, I think, worth thinking about what this discourse really means. The concept of techno-feudalism is certainly provocative, but the specter of feudalism haunting the digital age is a curious amalgamation of reality and metaphor. Advocates of digital age neo-feudalism often assert that capitalism has been killed, and some even claim that this isn't just a metaphor. Yet, these same commentators frequently concede that their usages of feudal terminology are indeed analogies, or that it reflects only an emergent tendency. So Duran and Dean make these kinds of comments. In truth, it's difficult to deny that the global economy remains fundamentally capitalist. Difficult to deny that the global economy remains fundamentally capitalist. As such, the concept of techno-feudalism quickly reveals itself to be ambivalent and analytically limited in its capacity to explain the dynamics of the contemporary digital economy. To move beyond the conceptual confusion surrounding techno-feudalism, it's useful to return to Marx's Capital. The text. Notably absent from most techno-feudalist critiques is a serious engagement with Volume 3 of Capital, particularly its theory of rent. With few exceptions, scholars have largely overlooked the relevance of this aspect of Marx's work to the analysis of today's digital economy. This theoretical omission has contributed to the tendency to equate contemporary rent extraction directly with feudalism, bypassing a critical assessment of rent within capitalism itself. In this context, the publication of Marx's economic manuscripts and notebooks in the Marx Engels Gesamtausgabe, the MEGA, the MEGA, is highly significant. These texts illuminate the later Marx's theoretical developments in rent theory and offer a crucial foundation for analyzing rentier capitalism. By extending Marx's framework, this paper argues that rentier capitalism represents the most advanced and possibly final form of capitalism, the highest stage, the real highest stage. Marx's theory of rent reveals the destructive tendencies of this system, particularly through its monopolization and predation of the commons. Now, of course, this is not to suggest that Marx anticipated the current situation in its entirety. A crucial problem that Marx did not foresee is the profound crisis facing contemporary anti-systemic movements. Rentier capitalism, bolstered by new technologies of surveillance, and behavioral manipulation increasingly establishes a total subsumption of life under capital, thereby eroding the possibility of anti-capitalist solidarity. Total subsumption, right? Erodes the possibility of anti-capitalist solidarity. In the absence of powerful anti-systemic movements, social, economic, and political instability is likely to intensify in the years ahead, potentially culminating in a shift towards a more authoritarian regime. Well, that's kind of where we are now. Section 2, why the techno-feudal thesis misses the point, reflecting on the decline of left-wing movements amid the rise of the digital economy. Fisher, I think Mark Fisher, I think, famously lamented that it is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. It's probably a truism in that sense. Yet today, one might be tempted to argue that digitalization has, in fact, brought about the end of capitalism. This end, however, differs significantly from what Fisher had in mind, and even more so from what Karl Marx envisioned some 150 years ago. Capitalism has not been overthrown by the working class in a progressive historical transition towards socialism driven by the development of productive forces. On the contrary, history now appears to be moving backwards from capitalism to feudalism. Sort of wait for a moment and think about this. According to this interpretation, recent rapid technological advances in the digital sphere have led capital to kill capitalism itself, ushering in an era of techno-feudalism, Varoufakis. Now, if capital is killing capital itself, it sort of achieves kind of the, if you were thinking about Marx's crisis theory, that's kind of, it's kind of fulfilling its promise in that sense. To give it a name like techno-feudalism, I don't know how helpful that is. That's an interesting question. Now, assuming that it is viable, why is feudalism reemerging in the digital age? At the core of this argument is the claim that today's digital economy is driven less by the production of goods and surplus value and more by competition for monopolistic rent. Rent extraction has become a dominant and predatory economic practice, diverging significantly from the foundational logic of capitalist production, which centers on the exploitation of labor to generate surplus value. In this new paradigm, users of digital platforms are described as cloud serfs, who, rather than cultivating land and paying ground rent to landlords, cultivate digital platforms through the production of data, effectively paying digital rent to access goods and services offered by cloud fiefs, as in fiefdoms or fiefdoms. Now, through the monopolization of vast digital platforms, cloudalists have constructed a space in which the defining features of capitalism, such as the quote-unquote free market, competition, profit, and exploitation, are increasingly supplanted by feudal characteristics, including monopoly, appropriation, and rent. Every activity within this space is meticulously planned, manipulated, and coordinated by algorithms designed to maximize the profits of platform owners. Even Thiel, founder of PayPal, discoverer of the Antichrist, acknowledges the neo-feudal nature of contemporary tech companies from an entrepreneurial perspective. The companies that create new technology often resemble feudal monarchies rather than organizations that are supposedly more quote-unquote modern. Given this, what, if anything, is problematic about the popular re-feudalization thesis? Morozov has already criticized techno-feudalism as an inadequate concept, arguing that major tech companies are actively engaged in fierce competition to maximize profit through the production of new commodities, such as index search services like Google, and novel entertainment experiences like Spotify and Netflix, as well as through substantial investments in data centers, cloud infrastructure, and artificial intelligence. This dynamic competition, driven by the logic of profit maximization, stands in stark contrast to the static image of feudal society. According to Morozov, techno-feudalism is often deployed as a moral critique of tech oligarchs by portraying them as lazy rentiers profiting through monopolies without engaging in productive labor. That seems a little simplistic. The more urgent theoretical task, he contends, is to critically examine the actual economic structures of the contemporary digital economy. It goes without saying in that sense. In fact, by failing to expose the internal contradictions of digital capitalism, the neo-feudalism thesis risks implying that capitalism could be made more aggressive simply by resisting a supposed return to feudalism. For example, Zuboff 2019 and Mazzucato 2019 advocate for a fairer and more competitive form of digital capitalism to be achieved by dismantling and regulating illegitimate monopolies held by big tech firms. Yet such faith in a more benign digital capitalism may be overly optimistic. Consider Apple, that is Zuboff's preferred model, which has been criticized for its monopolistic pricing strategies, offshoring of labor, violations of privacy regulations, systemic tax avoidance, and the lack of environmental responsibility. Muldoon, 2022. According to Morozov, such inadequate interpretations of the contemporary economy stem from an overly dualistic conception of capitalism. For Varoufakis, capitalism is defined by market exchange, with accumulation occurring through the exploitation of surplus labor, whereas feudalism is characterized by monopoly and the appropriation of surplus labor. Now, I don't think you can, divide it quite so easily, and appropriation as not being accumulative is, problematic as well. Anyway, however, this binary opposition, and it is a binary opposition between market and monopoly, economy and politics, exploitation and appropriation offers too narrow a framework for understanding the capitalist mode of production. In reality, capitalist development has always involved forms of appropriation alongside the exploitation of labor. I think that seems fairly obvious, but it's interesting to see this kind of divided in this way, or circumscribed in this way. Appropriation includes unequal exchange between the periphery and the imperial core, which returns us to world systems. Reproductive labor predominantly performed by women, Federici, 2004, and the appropriation of nature's unpaid contributions, Moore, 2015. The presence of widespread appropriation in the digital economy, therefore, does not in itself justify reclassifying the current system as feudal. Morozov's critique of techno-feudalism is largely convincing. However, he does not offer a capitalist theory of value that coherently integrates the dynamics of both exploitation and appropriation. Instead, he turns to Nancy Fraser. Nancy Fraser's framework as an alternative, yet Fraser, 2022, also only highlights the need for a multi-stranded critique, one that addresses class, ecology, the state, and gender. Things that you might not, if you're really looking at the Marxist elements of it, you wouldn't necessarily include, or you would assume that they're much more exogenous. As a result, the explanatory potential of Marxian economic theory remains underdeveloped in relation to the emerging digital economy. Well, yes and no. And I think the current discussion of finding actual simulation examples of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, I mean, in a real empirical numerical way, is on the one hand encouraging. On the other hand, it only gets there because you've made all of these mathematical adjustments. But anyway, Morozov ultimately fails to analyze the expansion of digital appropriation through the lens of Marx's labor theory of value. It fails to analyze the expansion through the lens of Marxist labor theory of value, much like Varoufakis, who conflates digital capitalism with techno-feudalism. Morozov blurs the historical specificity of today's digital capitalism by failing to differentiate between distinct forms of appropriation within the capitalist system. He thus overlooks the nuanced distinctions marked through in Capital, particularly in Volume 3, between various forms of appropriation operating within the market system. In fact, those who engage in this particular debate tend to refer only sporadically to Marx's Capital. This neglect is striking, given that Capital contains an extensive discussion of rent. One straightforward reason for this oversight is the widespread assumption that Marx's analysis of 19th century capitalism is no longer relevant. That's an important point, because I think you can see in the new sort of econophysics modeling that that it's the 19th century is still there from a classical model. But anyway, this perception is reinforced by chapter 6 of Capital, volume 3, which focuses primarily on ground rent in agriculture and mining. Now, these examples appear outdated in the context of today's digital economy. This is why David Harvey, 2012, seeks to update Marx's theory of rent by broadening its application. Quote, all rent, recall, is a return to the monopoly power of private ownership of some crucial asset, such as land or a patent. The monopoly power of private property is therefore both the beginning point and the end point of all capitalist activity. In a similar vein, Brett Christopher's 2020 offers a definition of rent that blends elements of mainstream and elements of heterodox economics. Quote, the definition of rent I use here then is effectively a hybrid of the heterodox and the orthodox. That is, income derived from the ownership, possession, or control of scarce assets under conditions of limited or no competition. You can see where this is headed, that in some ways you're making it more, as it were, static. But you sort of have to do that in order to get this to work out properly. However, both Harvey's and Christopher's treatments of rent are problematic. If any revenue derived from the monopoly of scarce assets is classified as rent, it becomes theoretically impossible to distinguish rent from financial income. Now, is it just a definitional thing? Is it about accounting? What is this about? Anyway, Christopher's critiques both heterodox and the neoclassical definitions of rent, but fails to develop a coherent and consistent conceptual framework of his own, ultimately conflating financial revenue with platform-based income. Yeah, I don't think you can. In all seriousness, you can't conflate the two, or it'd be very difficult, and you need to work through a criterion of how that happens, and probably at a very simple level, the difference is a kind of boundary movement between, well, Department 1 and 2, perhaps. Anyway, nonetheless, in his analysis, the basis of rent extraction is ultimately reduced to the mere ownership of crucial assets. The approach risks collapsing the distinction between surplus value and rent, yes, since surplus value itself also derives from the monopoly over the means of production. That's, Department 1, Department 2. There is a kind of monopoly position. It's only because it exists kind of at this micro level. Anyway, I mean, before you get to Department Two, you have sort of something that's akin to a kind of concentration uh, in terms of the how production is organized. In short, the definitions of rent advanced by Harvey and Christopher are both too broad and too vague to offer a satisfactory framework for analyzing the rentier dynamics of today's digital economy. Well, I wouldn't, totally close it off. That and the point is an important one about, understanding the difference uh, between or among rent and surplus value. Now, it is for this reason that a return to Marx's original account of rent and capital is necessary so as to avoid arbitrary reinterpretation. That's probably the big problem. Section 3, Marx's theory of rent in the digital age. It's a common misunderstanding that Marx's analysis in Capital is limited to the specific historical stage of 19th century capitalism. His exposition of the ideal average of the capitalist mode of production elaborates foundational economic categories such as value, commodity, money, and capital, which are indispensable for understanding capitalism as such. These categories are not confined to a particular historical moment, but are carefully abstracted from it so that they form the essential conceptual framework for analyzing any historical form of capitalism. For instance, today's financial markets and derivatives can only be properly understood once the concept of interest-bearing capital is grasped. The same logic applies to digital rent. Although Marx could not have anticipated the current levels of financialization or the development of the digital economy, this does not render capital obsolete. Does not render capital obsolete. Of course, this alone does not resolve the historical limitations of Marx's analysis. Most notably, his discussion of rent is largely confined to agriculture and mining. The section on rent remains one of the least explored areas in Marxian economics, and few scholars have attempted to apply Marx's concept of rent to the contemporary rentier economy. This neglect, the fact that people were dealing with it, has contributed to the rise of the techno feudalism discourse, which has filled the conceptual vacuum left by this omission. However, Marx is well aware of the limitations of confining the theory of rent to agriculture and the mining industry. This awareness explains his intense engagement with the question of rent in his later years. During the period in which Marx was writing books 2 and 3 of Capital, the mid-19th century witnessed, this is around we're thinking about 1861, right? Or 57 to 61 or whatever, the mid-19th century witnessed a rapid expansion of infrastructure projects, including railways, ports, and later, electricity and telecommunications networks. These large-scale developments often gave rise to natural monopolies, as market competition in such sectors proved exceedingly difficult. Now, this is just, the question of a natural monopoly is problematized, partially because it's a way in which we have to think about certain institutional structures, fixed capital, infrastructure, those kinds of things that determine, or you could argue overdetermine, certain kinds of ways in which we approach the problem. So market competition in such sectors proved exceedingly difficult. Well, and of course, if you're thinking in a much more elaborate sort of way, you'd cross subsidies to where the center subsidizes the periphery. That's an even further problem. But anyway, consequently, back to the text, they also become significant sources of rent. Server space, for example, perhaps, observing these transformations in the 1870s, the later Marx made efforts to revise and extend his theory of rent in response to the emergence of new forms of monopoly and value extraction. You can argue that Marx may, have written something and we haven't quite gotten to, or somebody hasn't found in the Miga, of discussions of, for example, fisheries. I mean, he mentions fisheries, but he doesn't sort of pursue it any further. And perhaps he had some idea, but then he never quite got to. That's worth thinking about. Nevertheless, the results of Marx's research from his later years are not clearly reflected in the current editions of Capital. That's true. Marx passed away before completing the work, and Engels subsequently edited Marx's manuscripts and published them as volumes 2 and 3. And we've looked at the whole rigmarole about this in terms of Heydrich and Mosley, etc. This editorial process created difficulties, especially for volume 3, as its main draft was prepared in 1864 to 65, and therefore fails to incorporate Marx's intellectual developments over the nearly 2 decades leading up to his death in 1883. So it sounds like that's more of a big gap. It's probably not as big a gap as one thinks, considering, what he was doing during that period. This situation created an unfortunate consequence for the later reception of Marx's ideas. Although Marx began to seriously develop his theory of rent in the 1860s, 61 through 63, 64 to 65, etc., the main draft from 1864 to 65 does not fully elaborate on this theory. As a result, most prior research relying on the Engels edited editions, we are constantly confounded by it, confined its analysis to agricultural ground rent, dismissing it as an outdated 19th century discussion. Engels was a factory owner, so you sort of think that he didn't want to take it as far as it could have gone relative to the overall context of rent. However, Marx's theory of rent is not obsolete, and there's no inherent necessity to restrict rent exclusively to agriculture and mining. Indeed, because there are different types of those things. In recent years, a new complete edition of Marx and Engels' works, the Miga, the Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe, has published Marx's economic manuscripts on Capital and his notebooks that were previously unavailable. Now, among these are manuscripts and notebooks from the 1870s, which provide valuable insights for reconstructing Marx's theoretical development during his later years, his final years, as Saito 2023. The theory of rent is no exception. After publishing Volume 1 of Capital in 1867, Marx began to seriously engage with the natural sciences while continuing his research in political economy. Now, throughout the 1870s and 1880s, the early 1880s, of course, he read various books on agriculture, forestry, dairy farming, and mining, drawing upon the latest findings in agricultural science, botany, geology, and mineralogy. His notebooks reveal a deepening ecological understanding of the irreparable rift, the metabolic rift, the irreparable rift in the social and natural metabolism under capitalism, alongside further elaboration of the theory of rent, Saito 2017. Additionally, during the 1870s, Marx closely followed the development of capitalism in America and Russia, focusing on the rapid expansion of, now this is important, the expansion of the credit system and rent. And, this raises a larger question, whether it's financial history or history of American style industrialization, that's probably worth looking at more closely. Back to the text. One notable achievement is the recent publication of Marx's notebook made around 1878. 1878, as part of his work on Capital Book 3. In the following passage, Marx clearly differentiates between ground rent and rent, treating rent as a broader, more general category. Now, this distinction marks a significant theoretical development in Marxist thought during the 1870s. And without getting into a big argument here, it would seem that he had already anticipated this even in his earlier works in the 60s. But anyway, because of the critique of people like Ricardo et al. Now, there are two things here, back to the text. Quote, there are two things here. Either this monopoly is only temporary and can be broken by the development of capital investments in the business in question, namely by ordinary capitalist competition, that the surplus profit is not fixed into rent. No, I would assert that they're quite different. Or the reverse is the case. Then it is fixed into rent, which, however, is again subject to great changes in its quantity, i.e., or e.g., the ground rent. On the other hand, branches of business which form natural monopolies, such as railroads, since their profit does not enter the regulation of the general rate of profit, that is, it cannot be depressed by competition at the level of it. Now, according to Marx, there are two types of monopoly: temporary monopoly and fixed monopoly. In the case of a temporary monopoly arising from technical superiority, this is the thing that we worry about at the most tedious mathematical levels, but it is important. It's the effect of, technology on questions about the rate of profit and the interest rate, blah, blah, blah. Technical superiority, the advantage is lost once the technology becomes widespread. So, without getting into a micro thing, but that's kind of an issue. As a result, the surplus profits gained by setting prices above the prices of production also disappear. Surplus profit gained by setting prices above the price of production also disappear. In such cases, surplus profits are not fixed as rent. No, I don't even think you get an accounting measure that does it that way. But, anyway, by contrast, Marx argued that in some instances, surplus profits can become fixed, F-I-X-E-D, fixed, and are therefore thereby transformed into rent. Now, what is this transformation about? As previously noted, ground rent resulting from the natural scarcity of land supply is one such example. However, rent also arises in sectors such as the railway industry, where various economies of scale create natural monopolies, thereby allowing surplus profits to be fixed as rent. Now, at this point, one can discern a significant new insight in Marx's thought, which is not reflected in the current edition of Capital Volume 3, edited by Engels. You'll note that's why I got annoyed and decided I would start reading the non-Engels editions of this, the ones in particular translated by Mosley et al. Now, Marx formulated a general concept of rent, distinguishing it from the narrower category of ground rent. Now, beyond agriculture and mining, Marx also considered sectors such as roads, railways, ports, and electricity. According to Marx, rent arises from the ownership or control of scarce, non-reproducible resources, that is, those resources that cannot be generated through labor, capital investment, or the use values of particular labor products. This is Basu's point in his book. In other words, rent is derived from resources which, unlike certain technological advantages, are either impossible or extremely difficult for capital to reproduce. Now, that's one way of looking at it, but the derivation of rent on this score completely is, I'm not sure. So, for example, capital cannot create land or natural resource deposits in the way that it can manufacture machines to increase productivity. Now let me argue there that that capital, if capital cannot create land or natural resource deposits, that is, in the way that it can manufacture machines to increase productivity, I would argue that you can, or something that structurally resembles that. And the way you do that is, okay, here's one way of arguing it. You could argue that the subletting market is a kind of form that confounds that issue. But anyway, furthermore, back to the text, furthermore, sectors such as railways and electricity demand substantial initial capital outlay, sunk costs, with lengthy periods required to recoup these investments. Thus, they rarely allow for genuine market competition. Now, that's one way of looking at it, but the other way is to address certain kinds of questions about the market for contracts on these kinds of ideas that do change this. Anyway, it's precisely these natural material constraints that prevent capital from deploying such resources freely, resulting in the fixation of surplus profits in the form of rent. It just makes our job easier to do it that way, but the reality is it's not quite as easy to do it. Although the fact that you are doing it raises a certain kind of mathematical question that I think in simulation you could actually see actually works, even from the econophysicist point of view, i.e., gravity exists. Gravity in the physical sciences model in terms of dealing with dynamics of models, and the analogy to physics, which on the one hand is scientism, on the other hand, still worth thinking about, but it is only one level of that kind of discourse. The math at that level, not identical to other, perhaps more quantum math of another kind, which do still ultimately still have to, in the final analysis, in the last instance, come to a kind of a monumental moment, let's put it that way, with how you array categories. But anyway, back to the text. Of course, natural constraint is not the only relevant condition. Although Marx did not address it directly, artificial monopolies, artificial as opposed to a real or natural monopolies in that sense, particularly those based on knowledge, such as patents and licenses. Now, note that when you think about an artificial monopoly like this, the whole market for patents or the institutionalization of patents and licenses also constitute unique conditions of production. Now, they're not perfectly unique. In fact, once you begin to think of it as just a more ideographic representation, as opposed to they are all interrelated in that particular context. Anyway, those cannot be replicated by other capitalists due to legal protections granted by intellectual property rights. So, without getting too crazy about it, it is that kind of, this is assumption disrupted by certain boundaries or bounding, and territoriality and a bunch of other things that would change the absolute and relative nature of these sets of structural relations. These cannot be replicated by other capitalists due to legal protections granted by intellectual property rights. Such monopolies enable their holders to raise prices and collect fees. Now, remember, this is also about contracts. Underlying this is, not just the question of raising prices and collecting fees, but this entire kind of structural shape to this, thereby appropriating a portion of surplus profit. Now, in this way, various forms of rent that extend well beyond the realms of agriculture and mining emerge as a fundamental category within the capitalist mode of production. So, various forms of rent. Now, what are those? I mean, we can begin to see, well, does the built environment fit that? Shipbuilding? Uh, I say that tongue in cheek, but there are ways in which we can talk about rent as it operates in highly uh, material, but problematic abstract forms. So, for example, let's say ownership of taxi cabs, ownership of airliners, maybe have that kind of issue. Um, maybe not. To sum up, the Marxian category of rent can be generalized as follows: fixed surplus profits obtained through the monopoly of non-reproducible, scarce resources of production and distribution. Fixed surplus profits obtained through the monopoly of non-reproducible, scarce resources of production and distribution. So is this an argument for scarcity? I'm not sure. Fixed surplus profit refers to gains secured by raising prices. Gains secured by raising prices. So price fluctuations in that sense, in its shape in that sense, do have can signify other matters. Fixed surplus profit refers to gains secured by raising prices through structural monopolistic control. Structural monopolistic control. Now, crucially, without getting in too far afield, I mean, you could see that how this operates in a kind of control sense, or in a monopolistic sense, in is price predation, for example, an example of this. Maybe not, and probably somebody will tell me I'm full of crap. Crucially, this implies that those who pay rent are merely incurring losses, as rent itself does not generate any additional value. Well, it may not generate additional value, but if you're beginning to think about cognitive capitalism or whatever, there is a certain materiality, with all due respect, to uh, expectations. And without going into a thing on this, it does seem to me that has a certain materiality to it, without going too far afield in a post-structural way. But anyway, indeed, Marx pointed to the illusion that rent constitutes value creation. This is the literalness of fictitious capital, namely that land produces value and that landed property possesses value. So land produces value, but landed property possesses value. So the value question is interesting in that sense. Rent is, according to Marx, false social value. So in other words, it is a social value, but it has falsity, not, this is kind of a way in which we could think about the fictitious capital angle with a little bit more trenchant kind of, well, anyway, since no new surplus value is produced. Now, this is a scalar question as well, but anyway, rent represents a form of predation operating within a zero-sum framework. This is a very, there's a lot there. Since no new surplus value is produced, rent represents, and you see, new surplus value is only, we're already restricting the bounds of this kind of argument, because I think at scale, surplus value is always being created. It just is being destroyed at it has a dynamic element to it in that sense. Now, rent represents a form of predation operating within a zero-sum framework. Nevertheless, unlike commercial profit and interest, rent is not a distribution of surplus value. No, it isn't. Rather, rent constitutes a distinct form of appropriation. So we've kind of moved into a different way of thinking about it. It isn't kind of it has more activity sort of implied in this. The fundamental insight of Marxist labor theory of value is that most economic value in the capitalist system derives from the scarcity of labor. Now, it's not so much the scarcity of labor as it is the competitive nature of labor power. There's labor power as, kind of fulfilling things or as speculative about kind of contract relations when you decide to get a job or whatever. So anyway, however, this does not account for all sources of revenue. In fact, rent does not stem from the scarcity of labor, but rather from the natural scarcity of means of production or distribution that are non-reproducible by either labor or capital. So this is that unpaid thing that kind of can be built into this. Monopoly over these scarce, non-reproducible resources gives rise to fixed surplus profits, but this is qualitatively different from value produced through labor. So monopoly over these scarce, non-reproducible resources give rise to fixed surplus profits, but qualitatively different from value produced through labor. Now, this is precisely why, this is Saito, this is precisely why Marx called rent false social value. The qualitative difference that call it false. To grasp its uniqueness, rent can be contrasted with commercial profit and interest. So rent as distinct from commercial profit and interest, which are mere distributions of surplus value among capitalists. Now, if we get down to details, it's not quite as clear as that, particularly with the issue of built environment, vertical built environment, for example. Anyway, in contrast, rent is not the appropriation of surplus value generated by industrial capital, but a much broader claim, as seems obvious. Rent's not the appropriation of surplus value generated by industrial capital, but a much broader claim on social wealth, as seen in Figure 110. In ordinary non-agricultural sectors, competition ensures that the market value corresponds to the level of output which enables firms with average productivity to realize only the average rate of profit. The level of output which enables firms with average productivity to realize only the average rate of profit. Firms with higher productivity than the average secure surplus profit, whereas those with lower productivity receive less than the average and forfeit part of the surplus value they generate. Now, in agriculture, however, where the means of production can be monopolized, that is, land plots, et cetera, Ricardian ideas, this equalization does not occur. Now, I don't know how definitive you can say that, but we can assume that, but I think there are other issues at work. So long as demand exists, the market value is determined. So long as demand exists, the market value is determined by the commodities produced under the least productive conditions. As a result, all other producers with superior productivity obtain a surplus profit, which takes the form of rent. Now, since rent is not grounded in labor scarcity, which hopefully seems obvious, it attains a purely extractive character compared to commercial profit and interest. I would assert to you that that's arguable, but it's an interesting idea, and you can see some of those ideas in terms of sectoral difference. The difference in the market price between agricultural and non-agricultural sectors. That's one distinction that you would make on the basis of the question of land, the fixity of land, I suppose. But that doesn't get to us at the end when we get to financialization. I would assert that this becomes more problematic relative to financialization. But anyway, today, rent has become more important than ever as a source of revenue owing to the significant expansion of opportunities of rent extraction brought about by new digital technologies. You see, we finally got there. The digital technologies allow for a greater manipulation of these matters. I think that they were always there in early digitalization, but in later digitalization, much more pervasive or pernicious or whatever. Unlike land, it is not inherently possible for new entrants to establish a digital platform. Not inherently impossible for new entrants to establish a digital platform. You, they can be created, out of whole cloth in that sense. Nevertheless, as with infrastructure such as railways, building a new platform entails substantial initial investment costs. Furthermore, due to positive network effects, the barriers to entry remain extremely high. This creates a strong likelihood of monopolies emerging, typically dominated by the company that first secures a large market share, such as Amazon in e-commerce or Google in search indexing. In other words, the frontier of capital in the 20th century shifted progressively away from industrial capital. Now, you can argue it in that direction, but another way to say is that there's greater unevenness among types of capital, which is not saying the same thing. Now, it moved beyond commercial capital, that is advertising and branding. Remember what we're looking at in the earlier table, and interest-bearing capital, which is financialization. Now, lest you get too nuts about this, advertising and branding has within it certain kind of constraints that appear interest-like. So that's a whole nother kind of question, but that may not work with certain ideas about financialization. Anyway, and today, digital rent extracted through platforms represents the newest frontier of capital. Therefore, building on the generalization of the rent concept developed by the later Marx, we should analyze the contemporary digital rent economy as the latest form of capitalism, namely rentier capitalism. Sadowski, table 1, right? Different forms of capital in chronological order. And this is the table that we were looking at the beginning. A frontier of accumulation, mass production of automobiles, etc. Commercial capitalism, more about branding and marketing, which is kind of the 70s to 90s. Its correspondence in Marx's Capital is the difference between industrial capital and commercial capital. Now, you could argue that there still are means of production, etc. in commercial capital. They're just different. They have they are different. Let's put it that way. Financialization is the third level and represents, as we know, interest-bearing capital. And then finally, the arguments that might surround digital platforms that are rentier capital. Now, that be useful to think about that in certain constrained ways. So arguing for maybe something that has more unique value algorithmically, is that a guarantee of what it's promising, since it kind of isn't promising anything on the one hand. On the other hand, it's producing a certain kind of durable nature. Anyway, so I put the table in there. Now, section 4 digital rent and its irrationality. So by updating Marx's analytic framework, it becomes possible to apply the Marxian concept of rent to the contemporary digital economy while maintaining clear analogies with ground rent. So land equals platform, water wheel equals apps, harvest equals data, ground rent equals digital rent. This your mileage may vary. If a monopolistic digital platform is constructed that enhances the efficiency of production and circulation through data collection and algorithmic coordination, its owner, the owner of the monopolistic digital platform, can secure surplus profits, akin to the way landlords extract rent from land with favorable natural conditions. Now, this corresponds to differential rent, right? The differential rent we saw, Ricardo, etc. Furthermore, the ownership of intangible assets, which is patents, copyrights, trademarks, that kind of stuff, acts as an artificial barrier to entry for potential competitors and enables the extraction of usage fees. This is absolute rent. Now, there's also a type of rent arising from the monopoly of particular means of production capable of generating a specific use value. Now, this type cannot be reduced either to differential rent or to absolute rent. It should be categorized, and this is, the more complicated issue, as monopoly rent. Now, monopoly rent as fixed surplus profit is in table 2, as we tried to show earlier, and it is here. Wine grapes, stuff, different rent, absolute rent, monopoly rent. However, there are also important differences between digital rent and traditional ground rent. In the case of land, only one individual or entity can utilize a particular plot at a time and pay rent accordingly. By contrast, software and digital platforms can accommodate millions of users simultaneously while requiring minimal additional investment for expansion. Now, that's true, but when you start thinking about what blockchain and, NFTs and stuff, aren't you sort of messing with that in a way? I mean, the problem, of course, is that you have to keep the servers on or whatever in order to get it to work, which is where the energy requirements are problematic. But anyway, consequently, the rent that can be extracted through subscriptions and licensing is far greater. You can argue that that's a markup thing or a variety of other ways in which you can talk about it. Unlike fertile land, which is limited in availability and subject to diminishing returns, rent from digital platforms tend to increase with scale owing to network effects and low marginal costs. This is all true until you begin to put, kind of constraints on it. As I said, blockchain might be that method, whatever. Moreover, the scope of digital rent is remarkably expansive, extending not only across the sphere of production, but also into circulation and consumption. Now, specifically, generative AI, artificial intelligence, and cloud platforms such as Microsoft Azure or Amazon Web Services, AWS, function as means of production, either by reducing manufacturing costs or by increasing labor intensity, thereby generating surplus profits. Advertising platforms such as Google and Facebook, well, they're not just advertising platforms, but anyway, enhance circulation efficiency and also contribute to generating surplus commercial profits. In the realm of consumption, tech companies increasingly adopt models whereby products are sold at monopoly prices with continued extraction of rent through subscription-based usage fees, as seen in Tesla and Apple. Furthermore, lean business models that economize on capital and labor, such as ride sharing, accommodation platforms, Airbnb and Uber, have emerged as alternatives to traditional taxis and hotels. Similarly, financial platforms like PayPal and Wise, formerly TransferWise, levy fees on remittances and payments. Opportunities for rent extraction are pervasive, making rent the new frontier of capital. Rent is the new frontier of capital. Footnote 13. The relationships within the rentier economy are highly asymmetrical, but many firms and users have little choice but to rely on big tech platforms. Big data related to manufacturing has become an indispensable condition of production, essential for improving the efficiency of production and distribution through inventory management, demand forecasting, early problem, quality assurance, early problem detection, and quality enhancement based, in this particular instance, on customer feedback. However, only a small number of large firms at the top of global supply chains possess the capacity and resources to collect and analyze such data, thereby securing asymmetric power relations with other companies and extracting rent from them. This is, you can argue that might be, one of the underlying issues for the formation of server farms. Where does surplus value go? Now, this reality underscores the difficulty of acquiring useful data. It's often misconceived that data is free and abundant with zero marginal cost. In Rifkin 2014, zero marginal cost. However, the collection of relevant data, its processing in deusable formats, and a subsequent analysis are far from straightforward. The profitable use of data requires massive investments in technological innovation, specialist expertise, and digital infrastructure, including cloud services, data centers, monitoring tools, data sets, and substantial computing power. Moreover, firms must ensure that users actively engage with platforms during their discretionary time to generate valuable data. For this reason, data produced and captured through digital platforms should be understood as a scarce resource. Now, unsurprisingly, big tech companies secretly compete to monopolize this still untapped frontier. However, competition among digital platform companies differs significantly from that in traditional manufacturing sectors, yes, such as automobiles or refrigerators. The immense sales and profits of big tech firms may create a misleading impression. From the perspective of Marx's labor theory of value, rent constitutes surplus profits mediated by monopoly and merely represents the appropriation of social wealth rather than the generation of new surplus value. So rent constitutes surplus profits mediated by monopoly and merely represents the appropriation of social wealth rather than generating new surplus value. Activities of rent extraction do not depend on value production, but are instead grounded in these false social values. In other words, while substantial investments in data centers, algorithms, and sensors undoubtedly represent technological innovation, they're not primarily aimed at producing surplus value. Rather, they serve to lock in users, extract data, enclose knowledge, and maximize rent. As the frontier of capital shifts from industrial production towards financialization and rentierization, the central role of industrial capital becomes increasingly marginalized. Industrial capitalists may still generate surplus value, but only to be appropriated by digital platform owners. In short, the economy as a whole does not grow, even as tech oligarchs accumulate increasing wealth. Instead, The vast majority of companies and users who pay rent suffer losses in real profits, disposable income, and a declining rate of profit. Nevertheless, firms have little choice but to continue investing in digital transformation. Falling behind would only exacerbate the losses. Attempting to offset these losses, companies intensify the exploitation of labor, resulting in stagnant wages. It's kind of what's going on now, but it's a much more variegated, I suppose. Alternatively, amid inflation, price gouging has emerged as an opportunistic strategy to appropriate values from workers. Yet, workers have already endured increasing hardship over decades of neoliberal reform. It's already the divergence is pretty high, which brought about cuts to social welfare, job insecurity, and declining real wages. Rentier capitalism worsens these conditions, contributing to the erosion of workers' purchasing power. As a result, the real economy stagnates. Although the information and communications technology, the ICT revolution, was celebrated as the emergence of a new economy to boost economic growth in the early 21st century, the outcome has proven markedly different from expectations. Duncan Foley, 2013, an extremely unequal society characterized by the long stagnation, as well as the divide between the 1% and the 99%. Now, one may wonder why a predatory economic model such as rentier capitalism has emerged, despite its inherent tendency to generate severe inequality and long-term economic stagnation. So, in many respects, it appears suicidal, nihilistic perhaps, even from the standpoint of capitalism itself. While techno-optimists continue to celebrate progress driven to advancements in AI, robotics, and biotechnology, the reality of the rentier economy diverges sharply from the so-called golden age of 20th century capitalism, which was marked by high growth rates, redistribution to the working class under the welfare state. By contrast, contemporary capitalism is confronted with a structural limit to accumulations characterized by persistently low growth rates and widening inequality, where we are now. Indeed, over the past half century, the capitalist system has been plagued by a falling rate of profit, sluggish growth, and prolonged stagnation. Kleiman's point of view. And capitalists thought to navigate the difficult terrain through the adoption of post-Fordist strategies, such as flexible production tailored to consumer demand, lean manufacturing, and the elevation of market value through branding, alongside neoliberal austerity, financialization, zero interest rates, and quantitative easing. However, these measures are now reaching their limits in the face of inflation triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine. In this context, contemporary capitalism is accelerating its transition toward rentier capitalism, which prioritizes new forms of appropriation of social wealth. In other words, the regimes of accumulation that characterized 20th century capitalism, this LaBrousse and Michel of 2017, appear to be approaching their terminal phase, giving way to an emergent regime of appropriation. So we've gone from regime of accumulation to a regime of appropriation under the rentier economy. Now, this shift reflects the fact that having exhausted the frontiers of the real economy, and with growth and capital accumulation stagnating, capitalism can no longer sustain itself without devouring the commonwealth of society. As noted in the previous section, the historical development of capitalism closely mirrors the logical progression found in Capital, the text, wherein the category of rent emerges as the final form of capital. Now, based on the preceding analysis, one might be tempted to speculate that Marx regarded rentier capitalism as the ultimate stage of capitalist development. This is because rentier capitalism is no longer centers on the production of surplus value, which Marx identified as the essential characteristic of capitalist production. So it doesn't center on producing surplus value, but the current cycle of stagnating capital. In other words, the current cycle of stagnating capital accumulation may signal a terminal crisis of capitalism under American hegemony, as Giovanni Arrighi pointed out 3 decades ago. East Asian capital, quote, East Asian capital may come to occupy a commanding position in systemic processes of a capital accumulation. Capitalist history would then continue, but under conditions that depart radically from what they have been since the formation of the modern interstate system. Arrighi, 1994. Now here, Arrighi alludes to the possibility of a new regime of accumulation emerging in socialist China following the decline of American hegemony. Now, his claim may appear persuasive given the rapid rise of Chinese digital platforms. However, the implications of Marx's rent theory extend beyond this geographical shift. The terminal crisis at hand is not merely the crisis of American hegemony, but rather the terminal phase of capitalism as such, the terminal crisis of capitalism as such. In this sense, the emergence of a new Chinese hegemony would not alter its ultimate destiny. Now, this is not only because the new regime of appropriation dismantles the conditions necessary for stable economic, social, and political order, but also because rentier capitalism fundamentally undermines the prospects for long-term prosperity for humanity as a whole. According to Marx, the problem with rentier capitalism lies not merely in its tendencies toward monopoly, appropriation, and inequality, but more crucially, in its destruction of the common. As discussed above, rent depends on the monopoly of a power that capital itself cannot produce. This is important. Rent depends on the monopoly of a power that capital itself cannot produce. In the case of ground rent, this power stems from the natural scarcity of land. In contrast, digital platforms monopolize human relationality, treating it as a scarce, non-reproducible resource. The establishment of a regime of appropriation, as opposed to accumulation, a regime of appropriation requires a thorough enclosure by capital. So we're back to feudal things. Yet land and human relationality are resources that should not be subject to monopolization, as they constitute the commonwealth of humankind and non-human beings. But you could see how AI could do that, right? Marx thus maintained that such commons must not be owned by anyone. Commons not owned by anyone. Now, once they've reached the point where they have to be sloughed off, then the material source, that is the economically and historically justified source of the historically justified source on the title, oh, then the material source, the economically and historically justified source of the title that arises from the process of life social production disappears, and with it all transactions based on it. From the standpoint of a higher socioeconomic formation, the private property of particular individuals in the something will appear just as absurd as the private property of one. In man, other man. I have to look at how that got lost. Even an entire society, a nation, or all simultaneously existing societies taken together are not the owners of the earth. They are simply its possessors, its beneficiaries, and have to bequeath it in a improved state to succeeding generations as boni patres familias. Now, the monopolization and destruction of the common for private gain exemplify the fundamental irrationality of the rentier economy. The less reproducible a resource is, the more rent it can generate. This is sort of prestige model, right? Rentier capitalism exploits the commons precisely because they cannot be reproduced in the short term. In an area of prolonged stagnation, so the monopolization and destruction of the common for private gain exemplify the fundamental irrationality of the rentier economy. Monopolization, destruction of the common for private gain, right? The less reproducible a resource is, the more rent it can generate. Rentier capitalism exploits the commons precisely because they cannot be reproduced in the short term. In an era of prolonged stagnation, the plundering of what is arguably the most vital foundation for humanity's long-term prosperity becomes an appealing strategy for securing immediate profits. This represents the anti-civilizational and deeply irrational outcome of rentier capitalism. This outcome is problematic for capitalism too, even if the transition from a regime of accumulation to a regime of appropriation is deemed successful. Rentier capitalism is unlikely to replicate the stable social order characterized by sustained economic growth and full employment that defined the Fordist regime of accumulation. In contrast, because the source of profit in rentier capitalism lies in the ongoing enclosure and expropriation of the commons, economic, political, and social instability and antagonism are exacerbated. The regime of appropriation thereby transforms into a permanent regime of war, marked by the militarization of political and economic life. So this is, in fact, you can see this in this idea that some things are weaponized in that kind of way. Section 5, total subsumption and the crisis of anti-systemic movements. The terminal crisis of capitalism is only one side of the story. Now, the other side is that the anti-systemic movements, so Rigi 1989, are also experiencing a chronic existential crisis today. Until the mid-1960s, radical left-wing movements struggled to overcome two conservative forms of leftism, namely social democracy in the West and Stalinism in the East, while attempting to chart a new course, ultimately without success. It was only after 1968, with the emergence of the so-called new social movements, i.e., e.g., anti-war activism, environmentalism, and feminism, alongside the rise of new labor movements such as operaismo, operaismo, that the left, which had previously been integrated into the corporatist system of class compromise and constrained by androcentric, Eurocentric, and economically deterministic frameworks, began to adopt a more radical tone. This is a McClellan move 85. Even after the crisis precipitated by the collapse of the Soviet Union, new movements such as the Alter Globalization movement, the World Social Forum, and Neo-Zapatismo continued to renew the vision of revolutionary transformation. Now, the high point of this legacy was, the publication of Negri and Hart's Empire, which proposed that the contemporary communist movement in the age of globalization and digitalization no longer requires a theoretical center, as with Marxism, Leninism, or a political center, such as the Comintern, and that various anti-systemic movements of the multitude could instead form alliances through decentralized, horizontal, and democratic networks. However, as rentier capitalism continues to evolve, the vision of the multitude has proven inadequate. A simple yet paradoxical fact confronts us. Despite the ongoing expropriation of the commons and the deepening of inequality under rentier capitalism, today's labor movement is more stagnant than ever. This situation is one that Marx did not foresee. He rather believed, in trade unionism, right, that the general law of capital accumulation would inevitably lead to the emergence of the working class as a revolutionary force. Now, to grasp this paradox, it is essential to understand how rentier capitalism fundamentally transforms life beyond the confines of the factory. What we are witnessing, this is the sort of the implication of operaismo, right? What we are witnessing is the thorough penetration of the logic of capital into every aspect of life. It has brought about the condition of total subsumption under capital. The real subsumption of labor under capital began with factories through the separation of, conception and execution. Traditionally, artisans carried out their work drawing on knowledge and insights acquired over years of experience and training. This form of tacit knowledge, essential for the process of conception, was not standardized and varied from artisan to artisan, making it difficult to generalize or transmit to new workers. The apprenticeship system thus limited competition, safeguarding both the status of the master and the employment of apprentices. However, as capitalism advanced, the artisan's knowledge was dismantled through the division of labor and replaced by codified procedures under scientific management, commonly known as Taylorism. Scientific management, recall. Simultaneously, this is, what Fordist production is. It is the kind of this massified, application of Taylorism. Simultaneously, mechanization transformed and reorganized work into simplified tasks that could be carried out even by unskilled workers. Now, these unskilled workers, lacking the experiential knowledge of their skilled predecessors, became easily interchangeable and increasingly dependent on manuals and training provided by capital. In this way, workers were deprived not only of the objective means of production, but also of the subjective capacities necessary for autonomous productive activity. As a result of this real subsumption, laborers came to passively execute the commands of capital. The subsumption under capital is an ongoing process. Under digital Taylorism, Alton Reed of 2022, the use of cameras, monitors, and sensors serves to intensify and extend managerial control, subjecting workers to heightened discipline, surveillance, and competition. As seen in factory automation, the GPS-based directives used by Uber and Lyft, and algorithmic management, more broadly, the scope for workers' autonomous decision-making continues to shrink. Despite the rhetoric surrounding the promotion of a free and flexible working style, gig work deepens workers' dependence. Gig work deepens workers' dependence on digital platforms. Even their private cars and homes become subordinated to capital, repurposed as means for generating subsistence income, subordinated to capital. However, the deeper problem lies in the fact that subsumption under rentier capital penetrates even further, reaching into the unconscious. Users spend increasing amounts of time doing this kind of stuff, time online, willingly generating data, engaging with AI in ways designed to elicit seamless responses, right? Chatbots, trusting its recommendations and adjusting their actions accordingly. In this process, users often fail to recognize how their thoughts and desires are being shaped, manipulated, and redirected by algorithms to serve the interests of platform owners. Digital platforms subtly discipline users into becoming servants of tech companies. It is within rentier capitalism that the machine truly becomes an automatic subject. Artificial intelligence and algorithms make the decisions in favor of capital accumulation, and humans merely follow them. The scale of surveillance, planning, and behavioral guidance enacted by tech companies continues to expand, culminating in the reification of life. Reification of life. As a result of digital subsumption, the realm of communication is undergoing profound transformation. Digital technologies offer an abundance of free or inexpensive information and recommendations, yet this very accessibility has contributed to the proliferation of conspiracy theories, hate speech, and misinformation. At the same time, digitalization facilitates the instant gratification of individual desires at the click of a button, thereby marginalizing short-term social goals and aspirations. This shift in communicative practices also deepens social atomization by promoting social media influencers as models of economic success. Digital platforms now present unprecedented opportunities for side jobs, entrepreneurial self-expression, but this individualization further erodes the collaborative sphere of communicative action. Consequently, the formation of intersectional solidarity among anti-systemic movements is increasingly undermined. So, despite Hart and Negri's advocacy for horizontal and democratic networking of the multitude, communication on digital platforms is neither equal nor free. Rather, it reproduces the deeply asymmetrical structures of the platform economy in which the vast majority are subjected to exploitation and appropriation under the guise of autonomy. Nonetheless, the illusion of autonomy in both work and consumption within the digital economy compels individuals to behave as if they themselves were entrepreneurs, often opposing state regulation and redistributive policies. Many begin to invest in consumerist lifestyles and financial products, day traders, right? Despite the reality that only the ultra-wealthy stand to gain from further processes of financialization and renterization. So, given the wide extent of the ongoing subsumption of life under rentier capital, it is no coincidence that the labor movement is experiencing unprecedented stagnation despite increasing dire living conditions. Life itself is now almost entirely incorporated into techno capitalism, which fosters a desire for voluntary submission through the manipulation of information, thought, desire, and behavior. As a result of this total subsumption, wherein all aspects of life are encompassed by techno-capitalist relations, the traditional path to socialist revolution appears effectively foreclosed. Oh, darn. The dark future that looms is one of techno-fascism, an authoritarian regime predicated on top-down, scientific management led by technocratic engineers. Mimura's 2011. It is not contradictory for capitalism to demand a strong state apparatus that excludes immigrants, minorities, so-called criminals in the name of defending personal freedoms and private property. In a similar vein, it is not surprising that rentier capitalism would converge with authoritarian governance in order to consolidate monopolies and uphold social order amidst mounting social, political, and ecological instability. In doing so, rentier capitalism constructs a predatory, hierarchical system for the monopolization and expropriation of the commons. While the authoritarian, anti-liberal, and xenophobic tendencies of techno-fascism intensify mechanisms of surveillance, exclusion, and discrimination, this coercive power ultimately targets not only marginalized groups, but the majority who inhabit the system. This dynamic underpins the emergence of Lazaretto terms a civil war. We're getting to the end. Section 6, conclusion. However, total subsumption of life under digital capital is not absolute. It's not only anti-systemic resistance that finds itself in profound crisis, as the preceding analysis has shown. The broader prospects for economic growth are also diminishing under rentier capitalism. The survival strategies of capitalism as a system premised on infinite accumulation are increasingly exhausted, leaving only the path of systemic robbery and plunder. Even if the transition to rentier capitalism is realized, the new regime of appropriation cannot replicate the conditions of stable social integration once made possible by the Fordist regime of accumulation, which was anchored in economic growth and full employment. Instead, because the source of profit in rentier capitalism lies in the continual enclosure and dispossession of the commons, economic, political, and social instability is bound to deepen. The future of capitalism under this regime points not towards renewal, but towards escalating crises. In this context, the growing reliance on authoritarianism to preserve order is less a sign of strength than an expression of the system's structural fragility. How the double crisis of capitalist accumulation and of anti-systemic movements will evolve remains uncertain. Confronting this impasse demands first and foremost a clear recognition of the transformation under rentier capitalism without retreating into techno-feudalist frameworks. Capital, the text, Marx's Capital, remains an indispensable resource for understanding both the historical trajectory of capitalism and the intensifying logic of total subsumption. Intensifying logic of total subsumption. Yet, imagining a post-capitalist future in the digital age requires going beyond Marx's original vision. Our task today is to deepen the critical analysis of economic, social, and political destabilization by engaging with Marx's theoretical tools. A thorough reappraisal of its largely neglected theory of rent is the necessary starting point for this endeavor. Okay, so we got to the end finally, right? And we will do this again in review on Wednesday. Lest you think that's unimportant. This, as one gets older, one can see how problematic things become in that way. All righty then. So back to